I think maybe we'll just go with the 3 questions for the moment, and then you'll be first in the next round. So that's overseas aid, timescale and blueprint for independence, how's it going to work, and then with regard to the 8th richest country, how was that figure arrived at? I wonder if I could ask Anna to...
overseas aid, I think the statistic given of the 8th richest country in the world, I don't think if we vote for independence, what we're saying is that we should become insular as a country. I know there's a national debate that's regularly used. I also don't think actually whether it be in Scotland or whether it be in England or Wales, that the ordinary people are so insular that actually they would want to deny aid to those people that require it. I think that if we vote for independence and we take our seat amongst the nations of the world, then aid is a valuable thing. If we're the 8th richest country in the world, yes, we should have overseas aid. I do not believe those people that say we should cut aid. What I don't believe in, however, is aid that doesn't get to the people who deserve it, that actually ends up in the pockets of corrupt regimes, that ends up in cases that we regularly support through arms, economics, whatever the hell you want to call it, but we regularly support them. I don't believe that they should have control of the aid. And that's why I think it's important that if we do become independent, then Scotland will decide how overseas aid is used. Because at this point in time, we don't get to make the decision makers. And I tire when I see, even during the earthquake, that most of in Pakistan, hundreds of thousands died, that most of the NGO aid that was getting through to ordinary people. But when it came to actually from government aid and stuff like that, that would end up in the pockets of corrupt politicians, that they benefited to a great deal, and ordinary people still are suffering to this day as another winter approaches in Pakistan. On the question of democracy, I think you're right. The lady at the front about talking about MPs and MSPs, you're absolutely right. Democracy isn't working, which is why I want independence. Because for far too long, we've had a situation where everything has been modelled on the so-called mother of parliaments. The mother of parliaments that has dragged us into this for over 300 years, that's dragged us into illegal wars, that butchers people around the planet, that we have to spend our time apologising for the actions of the likes of Tony Blair and the rest of them. And what I'm saying is that, yes, common independence, now let's decide what sort of model of democracy we want for the people of Scotland, which won't be tied to the apron strings or to the butchers and the thieves and the coalition that exists in Westminster, that actually we will decide finally what sort of thing we want. And if it means axing of MSPs, if it means getting rid of more councils, or if it means increasing the councils, I actually believe in more democracy. I think that more people should be able to decide. More people should be involved. And the tragedy is that more people are not involved. This is a fantastic meeting. It actually shows that people are interested in politics. For too long, what we've heard is that people are more interested in X Factor, more interested in Coronation Street and EastEnders. I am interested in Coronation Street and EastEnders and X Factor, but I also happen to be interested in politics. And I think more people would take part if they actually thought they could make the decisions, they could actually decide what's going to happen, and they had a role to play, rather than, for instance, I remember in February 2003, marching with over 150,000 people in Glasgow, over 2 million people marching on the streets of London, and what did Tony Blair have to say? Absolutely nothing. We will still go to war, despite the fact that 80% of the people of this country said no to war. With independence, we will say no, and we will decide what happens. That's the way we should have democracy. I'll let Nicola answer the stats on the
briefly on the first question, SNP policy is to commit to 0.7% of national income for international aid. I agree with Amer's points about making sure aid gets to the right people, but I believe rich countries, relatively rich countries, have an obligation to the poorest in the world, just as we have an obligation to try to lift our own people out of poverty. Lady down at the front here, in terms of, I think the questions you've raised are absolutely valid questions, and people do need to know the very practical answers to the very practical questions that they've got. That's why next month we will publish the white paper on independence that will give not just the vision for independence, not just the kind of arguments for independence that you've heard tonight, but the very practical answers about how it will all work, how we'll make the transition from a yes vote to becoming independent, what Scotland will look like in the early days of independence, the structure of the state. So you'll have plenty of opportunity, and anybody who wants that white paper will be able to get it. We won't propose an increase to MSPs. I don't think there is a need to increase the number of MSPs. Maybe make Parliament work a bit harder but not increase the numbers of MSPs. I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a very, very legitimate debate to be had in Scotland about the balance of responsibility between our national parliament and our local authorities. But if we're going to have that debate in a meaningful way, we first have to get these responsibilities back to Scotland before we can decide how to share them out within Scotland, which is why independence is the key first step. I actually think we're in a much better position on some of these issues than we were in 1997 when the Parliament was being set up, because then we went from not having a Parliament at all to setting up a brand new institution. We've got the institution now there. It already does a lot of the things that matter to people in Scotland. The question we're now being asked is if we want to complete its set of responsibilities so that it's responsible for all of the things that matter in Scotland, not just some of the things. So we've made half the journey. We've done half the journey already. We just need to complete it. And again, in the middle, the 8th wealthiest country in the world is a statistic based on GDP, economic output per head of population, and when the world means OECD. So if you took Scotland's GDP per head of population right now, we'd rank 8th in all of the OECD countries. I think the UK, I might be not getting this absolutely right, but I think the UK right now is about 16th or maybe 11th, I can't remember, but it's below 8th anyway. But the point is, that's our starting point. You know, no country in the world is guaranteed to be prosperous. You earn your prosperity, you earn your wealth by the decisions you take, by the ingenuity of your people. And my argument is we're more likely to become a prosperous country if we have the levers in our own hands to do the things that will grow our economy and create jobs. So we've got a good foundation for independence. That statistic, we're not subsidised, even with, you asked about liabilities, even with our population share of the UK's massive debt. We've still got better public finances than the UK as a whole. That's a great foundation. But the real opportunity of independence is what we then build on that foundation. And it's on that basis that I would try to persuade you to vote yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So you Jazz first.
That's right. Okay, just very quickly on overseas aid. Yes, I agree with Nicola. Our party policy is that we should commit the UN agreed amount of 0.7% of national income to overseas aid. I think the UK currently gives about 0.4, 0.5%. So we're well below what the UN agreed figure is. Ideally, we'd like to get to where Sweden is, where they give nearly 1% of their national income. I think that Nicola's right. There is a responsibility of rich nations to assist the more developing nations to develop. And I think that there should not be a conflict between ensuring that we create a more equal society at home and helping to support development overseas. Jane, thank you very much for your question. I'm sorry that I failed to convince you on improving democracy. I did talk about independence not being an end but being a process, and ensuring that we devolve power much further down to local authorities and also to community councils as well. I also think that successive Holyrood governments have when it comes to setting budgets, they've basically come to local authorities like mine, Edinburgh Council, and said, here you go, here's your settlement. If you freeze council taxes, then this is what you get. If you don't freeze council tax, then you get a lot less. So it doesn't really empower local authorities to set a budget that the local people who elect that local authority necessarily want to see. And indeed, in many European countries, in Germany, for example, if Angela Merkel went to the lender and tried to say, here's your budget, if you don't accept that, you'll get less, that would be illegal, that would be against the national law. So I think we should be empowering local authorities and refreshing our local democracy, not just through local authority level, but also to community council level as well. And in terms of the question about the richest country in the world, I mean, even David Cameron has accepted that Scotland is rich enough to go its own way as an independent nation. So I think that unionist myth has been well and truly busted.
Thank you, Matt. Well, one thing I would say to Jane, is that Slovakia and the Czech Republic managed to get things together inside 6 months, with no history and no pattern of administration such as we're fortunate enough to have here. Now, they also changed their mind. They started out, they had a currency union, then they changed, decided it would be better to go back to what they were. But if they can do it, if the three Baltic countries, for example, all of which were repressed and whose populations were all in two minds as to what nationality they were, if they can manage to get it together in under the time that we've suggested it might take to iron out the first kinks in the Scottish independence settlement, I mean, I think we're no daft. Our heads don't zip up the back, as they say. We've got plenty corporate experience, plenty administrative experience. We've just got plenty of everything, and that's what's wrong. Folk are looking, I think, for very, very small details, and they're latching onto them and they're criticising them instead of seeing the opportunities that arise to do things differently. We might not have more MSPs, but you'll need some sort of revising mechanism. Now, you don't want a chamber such as the second chamber of the House of Lords. I mean, there's self-humiliation, I think, for any MSP to suggest that. But what you could do is lots of independence in Parliament. That's something. That's a check on the executive. But we've got to think in these things. You've got to think in the level of autonomy that the islands groups will want. You've got to think in whether or not we should have the number of local authorities or whether we could combine some and so on. All that is there to be decided. It's going to be great fun, and look at the energy that will be released as you're doing it. It'll be good for us.
Are we going to be able to stop the bankers obtaining bonuses for doing their job and then the ratepayers have to bail them out?
Gentleman out there in the dark blue jacket, just next to yours. Just there, yeah. Thank you.
Just wondering, I'm a Labour supporter, I've been all my life. Now you're asking me to vote for the independence, SNP. No, that's not what I'm trying to say. That's what everybody else
That's what I think.
You're right, Margot. I read your article last night in the news. It's quite good.
Thank you very much. No, but you're right, you're absolutely right. So what do you suggest that up here we would do?
The reason people are asking for policies, I don't see the biggest problem you've got is getting in, or getting independence. And how are you going to tell the press to back you up?
Well, that was occurring to me when I was listening to some of the things that Jane was saying. Supposing we have the vote on the Thursday, is it a Thursday? Right. If we have the vote on the Thursday, do you think the Scotsmen on the Friday will start saying, come and join us, we're all great? I don't think so. It'll take them a wee while to get used to the fact that the game has changed.
You better understand that 90% of Scotland read the Sun.
Don't read it, they'll look at it.
You could read my column on Sunday though, that's different.
Not me, by the way, I'm a mirror reader.
That's right. So asking.
How do you intend to put yourself forward? Because obviously the press will go back in here then.
All right, and just lastly, the woman in the t-shirt, just there.
Thanks. My name's Sarah. I stay just around the corner. I'm in the Green Party. I'm in their Radical Independence campaign, the National Collective. I mean, so many things that I've kind of had 3 meetings on tonight and chose to get with this one instead. And all those meetings that I'm going to at the moment, there are so many people standing up saying, but what about this whole question of monarchy? I don't want a queen. I don't want a queen as my head of state. What about this question of a currency union? Why do you want to stay in the sterling? Why not be properly independent and have our own currency? And about this question of centralisation versus further devolution, which Jazz has been talking about, with actually devolving power down to the people. For me, that's what independence is really about. And I think this lady here was quite right to say that a lot of us are kind of looking around going, where are the policies on this? And I know Nicola's right to say a vote for yes next year is a vote for the choice to make those policies happen that we all hear about. But you've got a white paper coming out next month. And my worry is that it's just not radical enough, that it's just more of the same, that you're not taking in the questions of head of state, you're not taking in the questions of currency union. And I wonder whether, on your journeys round, Nicola, whether you've actually have moved at all further to a more radical position where you're taking on board the ideas of people that I've been speaking to recently, that I've been listening to, that are saying they want something different, something more different from the kind of same old but a wee bit safer that you're offering at the moment. Okay. Thank you.
How bankers will be dealt with, support or otherwise in the press for independence, and radical agenda or not in the independence debate. Let's start with chairs.
Thank you very much. Okay, on bankers' bonuses, well, it's interesting. Bankers' bonuses and the whole financial collapse is often brought up by the no side as a reason why Scotland couldn't possibly be independent, because the cost of bailing out the banks is far more than Scotland could have afforded. Of course, if you look at the actual figures, Scotland could quite easily have afforded to bail out the banks. But the key question is, would we have put the regulations in place to allow that crash and those bonuses to happen in the first place? And I think we have an opportunity with independence to create financial regulations which allow financial services companies to thrive if they are doing an ethical business. If they're actually not paying obscene amounts of bonuses, and if they're actually providing a genuine benefit. I think we have an opportunity to ensure that the regulations are in place, to ensure that the financial crash that happened doesn't happen again. On the issue of the Labour supporter who says voting for independence is the same as voting for the SNP, you won't be surprised to hear that I disagree with you. But actually I understand that the fastest growing group within the Yes campaign is Labour for Independence. I was marching alongside them at the independence rally a few weeks ago, and they are growing in numbers because increasingly Labour supporters recognise that there is a massive opportunity at the vote next year to create a far more progressive political culture within Scotland that simply does not exist if we remain tied to Westminster. So don't worry that voting yes might alienate you from some of your Labour colleagues and comrades. I'm sure many of them will be voting yes as well. And don't forget Dennis Canavan, the former Labour MP and MSP, is chair of the Yes campaign. You won't be surprised to hear that I agree with Sarah on the currency. I think, crucially, on the issue of currency, I think if we're going to create an economy that is good for the people of Scotland, that works for the people of Scotland, then we need to have the maximum number of economic levers here in Scotland. And the best way of doing that is to create our own currency. But even if we don't do that, it makes sense to start going through. I see the lady in the audience shaking her head. Even if we don't create our own currency, because I recognise there may be costs as well as benefits associated with that. If we're to keep the pound after independence, we will have to negotiate with George Osborne about whether we get a seat on the Monetary Policy Committee, or whether the Monetary Policy Committee even considers the Scottish economy when it sets interest rates. And we will be far stronger in our negotiations with George Osborne if we have an alternative. And the alternative would be to set up our own currency. So I think it's in our interests to at least start considering how Scotland could have its own currency.
The two economies are going to be so differently based that it calls out for separate currencies. We would need to have our own currency anyway. If we use the pound as a bridge to get to that stage, that's fine. The Irish took a very long time to do it, but actually that's what they did, and the pound shadowed the pound. So, I mean, don't worry about that. We're not daft. We know how to do these things. And even people who thought, in common with Gordon Brown, that the regulation on banking, that should be very light touch, as they put it. In other words, we can get away with murder as well as the big bonuses. They have learned their lesson now. That will no longer be the case.
I'll do them in reverse order, so I'll start with Sarah first. the white paper will be radical, it will be exciting. I'm not saying everybody in this room will agree with absolutely everything in it, but you know what? The chance to set out a prospectus for taking our own country back and having the chance to shape our country for the future, I think is very radical, and I think it's something that will energise the country. We'll ask people to vote on the basis of what's in that white paper, and you know, the SNP is the government right now. We won the election, got the mandate to have the referendum, and if Scotland votes yes, will be the government that takes Scotland through the transition to independence. So that's the prospectus we will ask people to vote for. But you know, the real beauty of independence is that the decisions about what happens to the country after we become independent are down to all of us. That's the beauty of independence. So if you have a different view in the future over the monarchy or the currency to the view that I have, you or Chaz will be able to put that to the people of Scotland, and if you can convince a majority of folk in Scotland that you're right and I'm wrong, then that's what will happen, because the democratic control lies here in Scotland. Right now, we don't have any choice over these things at all. With independence, it is down to us what we choose, and that is as it should be in a democracy. So the fact that you and I might disagree on the monarchy or the currency or whatever doesn't mean that we can and don't unite around the fact that first and foremost, we've got to get a yes vote so that it is people in Scotland that get the chance to choose, and that's the exciting, radical vision that we should be uniting behind over the next 12 months.
Deirdre,
yeah.
sorry, Nicola. I was going to say, just for a bit of fun, but ask just now, who would vote for a monarchy and who would vote for a republic? It's really serious.
Can we stick to who would vote yes? That's the decision that we asked to make. Anyway, let's not fall out, I hadn't finished answering the question.
No, I thought you might. I'm really sorry.
To the gentleman at the back, I totally agree. I am SNP, obviously. I'm the deputy leader of the SNP. But this isn't a vote for the SNP. I don't care whether you like the SNP or loathe the SNP. This is about taking charge of Scotland so that you can vote for whatever government you want. And you know what? Independence is probably the best thing that will happen to the Scottish Labour Party, because they'll no longer have to look over to their shoulder to their colleagues that run the I'm not sure, even if we convince everybody else in Scotland of independence over the next 12 months, I'm not sure we'll ever convince most of the media. But that's why we're doing meetings like this, to get over the heads of the media, to get underneath them, to get direct to people, and that's how we'll win the campaign. And lastly, whether it's bankers' bonuses, whether it's anything else, we can only get the ability to change things if we vote yes and get the power, and then we have the ability to decide these things. And that, fundamentally, we can talk about policy. I'm passionate about policy. I'm passionate about certain policies in particular. But the key thing we're asking people to vote for here is bringing the power to decide these things back here, rather than having it in the hands of a Tory government at Westminster. That's what you're voting on next year.